So our speaker today is Dr. Helena Suárez Val. Helena is an activist researcher whose research traverses digital humanities, science and technology studies, and media studies. She leads Feminicidio Uruguay, a project dedicated to monitoring, recording, and mapping cases of feminicide in that country, and co-leads Data Against Feminicide, an international participatory action research project that explores and supports activist engagement with data and gender-related violence. Helena holds a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at University of Warwick and an MA in gender, media and culture from Goldsmiths, University of London. Professionally, she has an extensive career in web development and digital communications for human rights in international and local NGOs, and she's a member of Uruguay's National System of Researchers. So welcome, Helena. I'm really pleased that you're here to present your work to us on strategic datafication. Over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Gosh, that presentation always makes me feel like now how to deliver. So I'm so happy to be here with FemQuant network. We were talking before you all arrived at Jenny about the importance of network building and of having these conversations. So I'm really, really pleased to be here talking to you today, with you today about strategic datafication. As Jenny said, I'm very happy to take questions. I speak very fast. I'm a second language speaker. So if you need any clarifications during my conversation, please do interrupt or add a question in the chat. And then we'll probably have, I'll probably talk for a little bit less than the 35 minutes, we'll see. But hopefully we'll have a lot of time for talking afterwards. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about strategic datafication and feminicide, which is a form of activism that I have been engaging in since about 2015 now. And also I've been studying. So to situate us, I first wanted to explain this concept of feminicide, which relates to the idea of violent deaths of women that have a gender-related component. In the UK, you probably will be more familiar with the term femicide instead of feminicide. The genealogies of the two terms are intertwined. In about the 1970s, Diane Russell, a South African researcher and activist, coined or used the term femicide for the first time to address gender-related killings of women. And but then in the 90s, this term was translated into Spanish by a Mexican anthropologist called Marcela Lagarde. And she asked Diane Russell for permission to translate a book called Femicide, The Politics of Women Killing. And she asked for permission specifically to make this slight amendment to the term. And instead of translating it as femicidio, which would be a more close translation of femicide, she requested for the use of the term feminicidio. And the reason she wanted to add that extra syllable is to make a stronger distinction with the term homicide. So where homicide can be understood as the killing of a man, somebody might think, oh, well, femicide then just means the murder of a woman. But this is not the case. Feminicide or feminicide, and then I'll explain a little bit how the two are the same in the end. But there was a whole discussion in the feminist movement about the importance of marking the gender-related nature of this murder. So not every murder of a woman is a feminicide. But the other thing that Marcela Lagarde was interested in was in getting the term a little bit closer to terms like genocide, not to imply the idea of a genocide, but to imply the responsibility of the states. Because the states have a role, one of the key roles of the state is as warrantor of our rights, of the human rights of its citizens. And feminicide is Marcela Lagarde wanted to express was a violation of women's human rights. Not only the rights of the woman whose life was lost in a particular case, but of all the women who are imbricated in the system that differentiates the power between men and women, and thus results in violence towards women having a very particular form that it takes. So this is kind of just to kind of get us into this context of what is a gender-related murder for women. Well, it's a killing where the fact that a woman is a woman has a bearing on what happens, right? The most common form of feminicide in many parts of the world is intimate partner feminicide, for example. And you'll be familiar with those. And those tend to be the ones that get more mediatized. But you might also think about the killing of women engaged in sex work, for example, or prostitution, depending on how you want to conceptualize that, or other forms of situations where the fact of a woman being a woman is what exposed her to the possibility of lethal violence. And also, I want to express that when I say women, my understanding of women is inclusive. So what I include in this term is cis and trans women, as well as women and girls and adolescents. So it's just, to me, I'm using it as a shorthand, so it's not an exclusionary term. So this is a very urgent matter. It's been studied with data, actually, all around the world by the UN and government bodies that have expressed time and again that it's an urgent matter that requires attention, and attention is not has not been given, although you probably, even from your own experience, those of you who are in the UK, you will have seen the term creep up in the news now. So I've seen this in the last 2 or 3 years, more used in headlines and more available in the text, in the discourse. Okay, so this is what I've been campaigning against, towards more attention to be paid to feminicide and for an end to feminicides and other forms of gender-related violence. Of course, I'm not alone. I'm part of a movement. I'm part of the feminist movement, and I wanted to bring this image here to you. Some of you may be familiar with this. In the little sign in the middle of the photograph, it says "ni una menos," which means not one less, and it refers to we don't want not even one less woman to be alive, right? So we want all of us to be alive. That's another tagline that has been used. Vivas nos queremos. That we want ourselves to live. We want ourselves alive. This movement got really strong in the 2010s. 13, 15, this photograph is from the Ni Una Menos manifestation in Argentina, in Buenos Aires in 2015, but it really got momentum around the 2010s. So as I've said before, then this is a movement, and that as a result of our activism, particularly in Latin America, has got to a point where we understand that feminicide or femicide is a gender-related murder of women and girls, that is inclusive, that understanding it requires an intersectional approach because it does affect more women who are in impoverished or other more marginalized situations. And of course, that thing I explained about the importance of framing it as a human rights violation, as a violation of the human rights of women. Now let's come to data, because you're probably thinking, where is the data gone? So in 2015, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women called on all countries in the world, or all UN member countries, to establish feminicide observatories. The uptake of this call has been patchy at best. So that we don't really have a very accurate representation of data internationally about what's going on with feminicide. But we do know it's a serious concern, because the data that we have, even if it's patchy, it's already quite critical. So governments have been patchy, and some of them are doing better than others. In Latin America, we do have pretty much all countries in Latin America except Haiti and Cuba have laws in relation to feminicide. Usually considered as an aggravating circumstance, I think to say in English. So, it'll be considered a homicide with an aggravating circumstance of gender-related violence. That would be in general, the legal framing of feminicide. in Latin American countries, although it differs. And these laws often require governments to produce data. Of course, if you have a particular crime with a particular name, then most states create data in relation to that, right? So that states do tend to know how many, burglaries there are. But in the case of feminicide, again, there was a call from the UN, but it's still very, very patchy. And it has a little bit to do with what I mentioned before. Do you remember I said where intimate partner feminicide is the one that most of us would be familiar? The other types of feminicide might be a little bit more diffuse or difficult to prove the gender motivation, or disputed, because some people will say that is not a feminicide. They might want to have a restricted, some countries have a more restrictive view where feminicide is only intimate partner violence. So in contrast with this, activists have jumped into the gap of missing data that is created by the lack of the poor data created by governments. And data has been created about feminicide by the activist movement for a long time. In this graphic that we can see, this graphic is taken from the book Counting Feminicide that was written by Catherine Ignacio. What we see is the number of projects that were the year a particular project started. So what you can see happening is there are projects, and this is of course recorded projects. There may be many other projects that have not been recorded or that were lost in time or just were very difficult to find. But since the 1980s, there has been activist production of data in relation to feminicide. I know activists who started doing it with fax, photocopies and faxing each other figures from different parts of the country here in Uruguay. We have interviewed activists who, started a notebook, just handwriting. We know of activists who made hand-drawn maps of feminicide as well. But what you will notice if you look at that graph is there's a massive increase of projects in the 2010s, which is what I was mentioning before. And probably this is to do with at least, I would say, three factors. This is my speculation as an activist who also started I started in 2015, based on my personal experience. I would say the first factor is the increased availability of tools to make data that were easy to use and that are easily available. They're free. So, for example, you have, of course, things like Google Spreadsheets, so you don't need even a Microsoft license, but you have more sophisticated things like infographics or Tableau or other tools that are free, are easy to use, and they're available to easily create and register and analyze and visualize data. The other factor, I think, probably precedes it, but they're all mixed together, is this visibility of the movement that I was telling you about. So this really strong visibility of the movement on the streets of Latin America since 2015, protesting gender-related violence. There was a strong emphasis on that, which in the North could also, ripples of it can also be felt in movements like the Me Too movement, which also placed a focus on violence against women. And so all of these things were happening around that time and giving each other energy, if you like. So we had tools were available. We have a very visible movement. So it's a visible issue, a more visible issue to put energy on. And the third factor, I would say, which is not less important, is the increased awareness of the power of datafication. The power of datafication. So what is datafication? Is this idea of making life into data somehow. And so in the last few years, we've seen it again. If this graphic was about datafication, it would shoot up even more. This idea that data are a really dominant language. We also seen it with the pandemic. where dashboards appeared in all the newspapers of the world, and suddenly we were seeing data as a privileged tool to tell a story about a social issue, right? So if we're thinking about the pandemic, there could have been, and there were, stories about people, narrative, illustration, artworks, but what was really dominant was to narrate the pandemic through data. So, I think this idea of data being a powerful language and it becoming so evident and so obvious. I'm not saying, of course, that it became powerful language then. I'm saying it was obvious how powerful it was back then, more obvious than it had ever been before. And so activists, this is a map that also shows the distribution. I just show it usually to show this the importance of Latin America. So this is a map showing projects that I have recorded around the world that map or record feminicide data. So, like I said, activists kind of are in this moment of datafication. We're in this moment of accessibility of tools. We're in this moment of high visibility of gender-related violence, and so something that had been happening for a while now, which was the creation of data about gender-related violence, became a form of activism that many activists took up, including myself. So hello again. Now I'm going to come back to where I am in this story. So like Jenny said, I started myself making feminicide data in a project called Feminicidio Uruguay. I started doing this in 2015. And it started actually as a collective project. So the picture you see on the bottom right is a march in the streets of Montevideo. And the signs, the little square signs that you can see, probably not very clear on your screens, but I can describe them there. The signs have the name, the age, and the date of a woman who was murdered. And in those, in about 2014, a group of us, I was in Uruguay. I was actually back from living in the UK. I lived most of my 20s and 30s in the UK, but I was in Montevideo. I got involved with this group. We were on the streets, we were marching, and we had made a commitment to march after every single case of feminicide. So every time there was a case reported in the news, we would circulate a call for action on social media, and we would gather in a particular point in the capital, but this also eventually was replicated in other cities in the country, the day after a case of feminicide was reported in the news. And so what happened was that after a few months, there were so many cases that we had been protesting about that we started to lose the shape of it. We started to worry about the memory of it. And we were worried about the memory of the women, but we were also worried about the memory of our activism. And it was then that we decided to start a spreadsheet. And because it was a group of us, we decided that Google Spreadsheets would be the most suitable tool because many of us could access and edit it at the same time, and it was free. And so we started recording the cases that we had protested already since the beginning of our actions in November 2014. And then we continued ongoingly to record new cases and new protests, in effect, as they happened. So this, as I said, started around November 2014, which was around the, perhaps some of you don't know this, on the 25th of November is the commemoration of the International Day for the Eradication of Violence Against Women. So usually there are a lot of mobilizations around that date, and we were kind of in that context. We had started mobilizing as well. It's interesting, the other interesting thing about that date is that it tends to be a date when data about gender-related violence comes out, because governments use them as hooks. You know, this international data become hooks for content creation, and data are also this way to tell the story about gender-related violence. And so we had this database, and then just life happens, and then I just continued doing this on my own. And I'll tell you about that in another conversation about the difficulties of doing movements. But I continued this endeavor on my own, partly also because I went back to England, and you know, the kind of distance complicates on the street action, of course, but it facilitated for me this form of activism, this form of digital activism, where I continue to monitor the media, I continue to add cases to the data set, and at the beginning, I also, this is quite a strange thing, but also from the UK, I often initiated the calls for action for people to meet on the streets, because I would be monitoring the media, and because of the time difference and so on, I could tell people when a case had happened. Okay, so this is a little bit of the story of how Feminicidio Uruguay started. So it was a collective effort. It is now an individual project, but I still don't see it as an individual project, because I think all of this, you know, all of feminist activism is a collective endeavor. You know, whatever you're doing, we're all doing it together. We're all learning from each other, and we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, we're part of a genealogy. So whether we like it or not, it's collective. This is how I stand before my feminist activism. Okay, so what can we see in this image in front of us? This is, all of these are representations of the Feminicidio Uruguay data set. And so those of you who are interested in visuality or how to visualize data, I think it's interesting to think about this. You know, I like to kind of make it strange in my head. You know, what does it mean to visualize data? So most of this, you'll find them, you know, common, like conventional, like the graph on the top right or the map on the bottom left. But then there's these two other things. You know, so I already talked about the march, and how the march can also be a representation, where each sign is a data point. And then it becomes a data visualization that moves, that chants, that screams on the streets. You know, it's data literally shouting on the streets. You know, it's a data visualization that protests quite physically, quite visibly. In the middle and the bottom, we have, so you might not be able to see that clearly, it's an embroidered piece of cloth. And then there's a strip of paper at the bottom. And this was, again, another representation of how these projects can never be truly individual. So in 2019, I got an email from a couple of women in Uruguay saying, do you mind if we use the data? And of course I said, no, the data is ours. And off they went and did something, but they didn't tell me what they were going to do. And this is what they did. They printed out the data. They invited people on social media, women and what we call dissidences, so any gender non-conforming or gender-added people, to volunteer to embroider together a piece of the data. And so they printed it out. They cut out every row. So what the little piece of paper that we see there is literally a row of data. And they put those rows in envelopes, circulated, you know, and I love the idea because I was at the time when I learned what they actually did with it, I was studying the circulation of data in social media. That's what my PhD is about. And so this was another way of circulating, like a physical circulation, put in an envelope, put it on the mail, and off it went the data points to somebody who then embroidered the name of that woman in a piece of cloth that was included in the envelope. So everybody had, the only instruction was to use that piece of cloth and to start and end at the same point. And then the artist got all the pieces of embroidered cloth back and stitched them all together in what became a 10-meter banner, which was then installed in a public square during the 8th of March demonstration. And again, the 8th of March is International Women's Day, and in Latin America, there's always a march in every capital city, at least. And so these are all ways in which the data from Feminicidio Uruguay has been circulating and has been visualized. And these are all very collective ways as well to move or to mobilize data. Okay, so let's get to the theory part. So I call this strategic datafication, and this is what I wanted to let you know about today, or to discuss or talk about today. So you probably will be familiar with other concepts that name activist engagements with data. So work, as I've just described. There's the concept of citizen data by Gabriel and colleagues, also has been used by Jonathan Gray and colleagues, and Aristea Fotopoulo as well. Probably one of the most circulating ones, I'd say, is data activism. That has become quite common to hear that. Oops, I lost my little part. By Stefania Milan and Miren Gutierrez, but also Alessandra Renzi and colleague Langlois also used it in parallel at the same time. Slightly different conceptualization, but similar track. There's also the concept of counter data that you might be familiar with if you read the book Data Feminism by Catherine Dinasio and Lauren Klein. But they were actually drawing on the work of Curry and colleagues and Mengan de Salvo on counter data and also counter mapping before them. There's also stat activism you might have read about. And this one, the last one, comes from Latin America, so you might not have read about this, which is critical datification, datificación crítica. And all of these, I think, are really, really good ways to describe my form of activism. And actually, when I decided to study my own practice, because the reason I ended up with a PhD is because I wanted to understand what I was doing. I wanted to understand what impacts it might be having, and I wanted to understand if there were ways to make it better, to do it so that it could have the most power. So when I found, along my studies, each of these, all of those spoke to some of what I was doing, and they really, I really connected with many of them. But I still kind of didn't. There's still something that I felt was like missing, and so it was in that spirit, not to contradict or to compete with these other terms, I came with this idea of strategic datification. So to me, strategic datification involves collective or individual practices of transforming human lives or deaths into data. And the aim, the main aim in these practices is to mobilize the epistemic hegemony of data. I'm going to say this really slow, the epistemic hegemony of data to achieve a social change objective. And to do all of that while being fully aware of the dangers and limitations of using what Audre Lorde would have called the master's tools. Okay, so this is the kind of big idea is to think about the mobilization of the power of data to tell a story, and for that story to be considered legitimate, right? We've been in electoral campaign for the last couple of years here in Uruguay, and this phrase became quite a catchphrase that politicians would use: "Dato mata relato," and they use it because it rhymes. But what it means means data kills narrative. So data wins over narrative, and I found it such a kind of a succinct summary of exactly the problem with quantification, which feminists have been engaged with since forever, right? Since the early discussions of is quantification even, can it possibly be a feminist method? What kind of things must we do so that quantification can be feminist and so on. So this, this is very, I think, for all of us, easy to grasp. Data is legitimate, and it legitimates. It's considered to be, right? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying in the epistemic, in terms of epistemic power, meaning the power to to say, this is how we know something. This is how we know something is true. This is how we know something is a fact. Data wins over other forms of narrative or other forms of telling that story. And so activists were not silly. We go, okay, if that's a powerful way to tell a story, and if that's what the authorities will hear as legitimate and legitimated, then we can use that. But that's not a not dangerous thing to do, right? Because every time we run along the establishment, instead of countering the establishment, we're in danger of being submerged in it. So this is why I decided to think about strategic datification. And I was, of course, inspired in, as I said before, those who come before us, and Gayatri Spivak is a big inspiration for this time. You probably had already heard the echo of strategic essentialism if you'd read about it in the term. And for those of you who might not be familiar with this, essentialism is this notion that women are naturally friendly, men are naturally strong, and it's this idea that there are essential characteristics to particular groups, and that those are natural, they're immovable, and essential to that person belonging to that group. And she coined this phrase, strategic essentialism, which later she disowned, but I still take it up. But you can read about that. That's interesting. And she was saying that in some cases, essentialized groups like Black people or women or Asian, in her case it was Asian people, can assume the discourse of essentialism in order to become agents of change, right? So she's saying to leverage that power. So, for example, if we say, okay, we're women, we identify as women because you identify us as women, then we ask for women's rights, right? So it's that way of assuming a temporary subjectivity because of, in the face of power in order to seek a change. And she says that this is only useful to do when there are political outcomes to be gained by gaining that essentialism. Otherwise, you're just falling in the trap, right? Interestingly, data has played and continues to play a part in essentializing oppressed groups. You need only think about all the data that proves that people of such a socioeconomic income are likely to be X, Y, and Z, right? Let alone all the AI predictions where data are continuing to be, to play that role in fixing these categories. So because of all of these resonances, I thought, okay, I'm going to think about datification in that way. Datification as a practice that is dangerous and that has been associated with imperialism, with colonialism, with the military, with the attributes of masculinity, rationality and facticity and all of that. This is datification, right? It's the conversion of everything alive into knots and zeros. It's like the antithesis of life and living in many, many ways. Although, of course, it has a potential. For example, it has a pedagogical potential and other potentials to use. This is what this is where I'm situating the concept. So datification is something that is a tool that has been a tool of oppression and continues to be a tool of oppression, but might just be strategically used to achieve social change objectives. But it's important that it is strategic, otherwise it doesn't work. And what does it mean that it is strategic? Well, that it has a clear political objective. We're doing it for to achieve a certain something. It's context specific. This, if you've read the Data Feminism book, you will see that context is one of the 7 principles of data feminism. So it's not all forms of datification will work in all contexts. We might want to datify particular things in some places and not others. back to strategic. Well, if it's a strategic practice, it tries to connect with a particular audience, so it knows who the audience is. So as I was saying before, we might use data for its legitimizing authoritative epistemic power. If we want to talk to the UN or to government, we might mobilize data in those contexts, but we might not mobilize it in others. Although, like I showed, data can also be powerful on the streets in a march. So it's not, what I'm saying is we need to know what we're doing the data for and who we're doing it for. And then, like other strategies, it makes a use of existing resources. It doesn't exhaust the resources that it already exists. It's time bound. It's, up for continuous evaluation. We don't, nobody does a strategy and then you just keep doing that forever, right? You look to see if it worked. If you achieved your objective, that would be the first test. And if you didn't, then is it something that you need to change in that strategy, or is it completely the wrong strategy? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then, of course, like I said before, it's aware of the dangers and the limitations implicit in datification. So we don't just discard all those doubts. We don't discard all those warnings. We, take them up as part of our strategy and are, continuously working with and against those. Yes. Now, what I'm saying is that strategic datification is a practice that can be engaged for social change. But I always think it's important to be careful, and this applies to the other concepts that we saw before: data activism, citizen data, and so on. That we don't romanticize these things, because anybody can be an activist, including an alt-right activist, including an incel, including a Nazi, right? So activism just means the seeking social change. Nobody says which social change, right? So when I'm thinking about strategic datification, although as I showed you, the origins of the concept for me are in a particular reading of a feminist reading of marginalization of oppressed peoples, I'm not saying that's the whole story. There's an interesting article, for example, by Rosemary Hill, I think it is, about the uses of visualization, data visualization, to support anti-abortion activism. So, the strategic datification of an issue can be used as a strategy for different issues and for different aims and objectives. So what I described before, my own activism and that of other activists who datify the lives and deaths of women to counter feminicide, I consider those are forms of strategic datification that center care. So in that sense, they're a practice of knowledge making that imply the material labor, and this is after Maria Puig de la Casa, of creating and maintaining datasets, but it also involves deep affective engagements and ethical political commitments. So it's really the commitment with the women whose lives are being identified, with the communities who are being affected, is part of how the data are made and is represented in the data itself in different ways. In that sense, it is a way of caring for the lives of those women whose lives are being identified, and it's also a way of repairing and healing affected communities. And Catherine, in her book, she synthesized it as a form of transformative or restorative data science. That, so data science put to the service of transformation and restoration of affected communities. Also, and this is coming to our space here, I think these forms of strategic datification that center care should be, and do, in my experience, serve to deepen the feminist community commitment to the feminist politics and issues. So us being here together to discuss data quantification from a feminist perspective. It's a form of community building, and in that sense, even this event today is part of a form of strategic datification in my way to conceive that concept. I said I was not going to be that long, but I am. It always happens to me. I'm just going to leave this really briefly just to finish here. And this is it's a form of a kind of alternative form of visualizing data that we call data artivism. I say we is myself and colleagues from the Data Against Feminicide project. As I showed you before, the embroidery, these are works that intervene in the visual contestation around an issue. So, this debate about whether feminicide exists or not, and what is feminicide, and all that kind of contestation, but visual contestation. So how the issue is represented visually. So data artivism is works that intervene in these discussions, in this visual discussion, using data and using art and craft. And I just wanted to leave you with those, just to see, just to end the conversation with a different form of data visualization. All of these are data visualizations of feminicide. They're all based on activist data sets of one form or another. In the center, you have a slightly longer view of the banner that I mentioned earlier. On the right, you have an intervention in the in Mexico City, in the Zócalo, which is the main square, where what you see, the little dots you can see there are people. It's a drawn image from the top of the squares. It's a monumental graffiti of the names of women that received the 8th of March demonstration for the year 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And then on the left, you have the Instagram account of No Estamos Todas, which means we're not all here, not all women are here, who engage collective illustration. So working off different activist data sets, they invite illustrators to recreate how the woman would have been in her life. And they post this on Instagram, and they create an endless data visualization. If you keep scrolling, it keeps appearing, of women whose lives were lost to the violence, but who we will never forget. And that's it. I'm just going to leave this here because these are some questions that we have about strategic datification, but you might have others. Thank you.